My name is Ava Holloway. I am 34 years old. At 6:12 on a Thursday evening, while standing in a hospital service corridor, still wearing my badge and a blazer that carried the scent of stale coffee and antiseptic, I listened to a voicemail that should have broken me. Instead, it clarified everything. My mother's voice was cold, polished, and controlled, the same tone she used when she wanted to appear righteous in front of strangers. "You're cut off. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." Then she hung up as if she had delivered a final judgment rather than abandoned her own daughter. I stood there facing a cinder block wall while a janitor pushed a cart past me and a code alarm echoed somewhere down the hall. I didn't cry. I didn't return the call. I replayed the message once, then again, because I needed to hear the contempt clearly enough to stop deceiving myself about what my family had become. They had not simply pushed me aside. They had finally spoken out loud what they had been rehearsing for years. I was useful only when I was resolving their emergencies, signing their paperwork, repairing their mistakes, and making their lives appear respectable from the outside. The moment I stopped being convenient, I became disposable. So I sent one word in response: "Okay." By 8 the following morning, access was locked, a house transaction had stalled, and the first crack in their carefully constructed future had already widened. Before explaining what she said afterward and why their lawyer eventually begged me to answer the phone, consider where you are listening from and what time it is there. I often wonder how far a story like this travels before it reaches someone who has lived something similar. What my mother failed to understand when she sent that message was simple. She believed she was discarding the family disappointment. What she actually removed was the one person who knew where every weak support beam existed inside the structure they insisted would never collapse. I was not an emotional ATM. For 6 years, I had quietly untangled the financial crises they created and then described as temporary misfortune. My professional background was not in banking or real estate. I worked in forensic compliance for hospital foundations and private care networks. That work required identifying where money was supposed to go, where it actually went, and what occurred when people assumed a trusted relative's signature could erase a questionable trail. My family never respected that work, but they appreciated what it could accomplish for them. Over time, I became the person who reviewed contracts they never read, corrected tax exposure they did not understand, structured payment plans they could not maintain, and translated consequences into language they preferred to ignore. Their most recent situation involved a luxury downsizing plan my parents had been celebrating for months. They intended to sell the old family property, route bridge funds through a temporary escrow arrangement, and close on a gated townhouse near the lake. They described it to friends as a fresh beginning. What they never mentioned was that the bridge arrangement existed only because I had reluctantly agreed to oversee the legal access chain, verify the source of funds documentation, and maintain shared authorization across two linked accounts until closing. This was not ownership, not theft, and certainly nothing dramatic or illegal like the exaggerated stories online. It was the ordinary type of administrative trust people take advantage of when they assume you will never stop rescuing them. At 7:43 the next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open and my coffee untouched, while my mother's voicemail repeated in my mind like a metronome. Then I did exactly what a competent professional would do when a hostile party clearly ends contact while still depending on her legal cooperation. I withdrew my participation. I informed the title coordinator that I was no longer serving as verification contact for the source documentation package. I notified the broker in writing that I revoked authorization to communicate on the transaction. I flagged the shared access credentials for immediate suspension pending identity revalidation. I also sent a short, entirely professional note to the family accountant explaining that any document previously routed through me would need to be reissued without my credentials, my review chain, or my indemnification language attached. There was no shouting, no threats, no speeches about revenge. I simply removed myself from systems that had functioned only because I was part of them. The consequences arrived faster than I expected. Within an hour, the townhouse closing was delayed because the seller's side refused to proceed with incomplete verification on a time-sensitive transfer. A restoration contractor my father had hired for the old property paused the move-out schedule because the deposit confirmation did not appear in the required format. A private care facility my mother had been pursuing for my grandmother's temporary transition requested updated payment assurances before reserving the suite she had been boasting about to her friends. That last detail made me pause. It was the first indication that this was not simply another upscale relocation plan. They were also relocating my grandmother, and they were doing so with a level of financial confidence that only made sense if they believed I would cushion every impact. By noon, the first call arrived. I let it ring. Then another followed, then several more. It was interesting how quickly "don't contact us again" changed into "why aren't you answering" once the paperwork stopped moving. Some families only believe in boundaries when they are the ones establishing them. I did not hear my mother's voice first. Instead, I heard panic, disguised as my father's voice in 2 voicemails left before lunch. The first attempted calm, "There's been a misunderstanding." 20 minutes later came the second, "You need to call us today." By 3 p.m., the tone had shifted from strained dignity to open alarm. "The title company says there's a hold. Patricia says you pulled authorizations. I don't know what game you're playing, but this has to be fixed before the end of the day." I saved the messages and returned to my work. At that moment, I was reviewing an audit trail for a donor-funded oncology wing while my phone vibrated repeatedly on the desk beside me, each notification more urgent than the last. When I glanced at the screen, I saw the family group chat suddenly active after weeks of silence, as though my existence had been restored only because their schedule was collapsing. That evening, I finally opened the messages. My sister did not ask what had happened. She accused me. "How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated. Do you even understand the damage?" The familiar family logic appeared again. Their choices became my fault, their lies became my responsibility, their embarrassment became my emergency. I almost replied, but then a voicemail transcription from my mother appeared, and I read it twice because the contradiction was so complete it felt scripted. She called me vindictive, unstable, and ungrateful in the same message, where she demanded that I correct the paperwork problem immediately. There was no apology for cutting me off, and no acknowledgement that she had told me not to contact them again. There was only outrage that I had taken her words seriously. The detail that changed everything appeared later that night when I reviewed an email thread I had almost ignored. It came from the care liaison at the private residence my mother had been using to relocate my grandmother. They were not asking me to pay anything. They were asking me to confirm whether the funding structure the family had previously described remained valid, because the deposit had been presented as dependent on proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which in turn depended on the sale of the old property. That sale now appeared stalled. The liaison was careful and professional, but the implication was clear. My mother had been pursuing prestigious elder care she could not actually secure without stacking one uncertain promise on top of another. She had constructed the entire chain on my reliability and then cut me off as though I were the problem. 2 days after the voicemail, I had 58 missed calls. Not an exaggerated number for effect. Exactly 58. Each one represented the speed at which control was slipping away from people who had spent years treating me like a backup generator they could kick whenever the lights failed. The calls came from my parents, my sister, 2 unknown numbers, a broker, and a contractor. Then at 8:17 p.m., a message arrived that made it clear the situation involved more than a delayed closing. It came from a law office. "Miss Holloway, this is Graham Pike representing your parents. We have a serious problem and need to speak tonight." I looked at the message, then at the old voicemail from my mother, and then back again. The phrase "serious problem" carries different weight when it comes from someone who bills by the hour. I replied with 6 words, "Enjoy moving forward. You said that first." Then I placed the phone face down and allowed them to sit in the silence they had tried to give me. The following morning, I learned what the serious problem actually was. It was not just a house. It involved reputation, leverage, and the type of paper trail families assume will never be exposed by someone inside. Graham Pike called again from another number, and this time I answered because lawyers rarely become dramatic unless something expensive is already burning. He began cautiously, almost too calm, explaining that there had been unexpected complications tied to the property sequence, the assisted living reservation, and statements made to third parties regarding available liquidity. I asked him to speak directly. After a brief pause, he did. My parents had already presented themselves to the seller, the care facility, and at least one social board as fully funded for a major lifestyle transition. My mother, who served on the fundraising committee for a boutique elder care charity, had leveraged that image everywhere. She had promised a sponsorship package, hinted at hosting an event in the new townhouse, and told people the family was consolidating assets smoothly. The liquidity, however, was not smooth. It was fragile. My father carried business debt I had never been told about. My sister had quietly exhausted a joint emergency credit line that was meant to remain untouched. The old property required repairs serious enough to frighten a price-sensitive buyer if revealed too late. They were not moving from strength. They were rushing before anyone noticed. I asked Graham the only question that mattered. Had anyone forged my review or implied I was still overseeing the process after my withdrawal? His silence answered more clearly than his words. Eventually, he said that certain parties might have relied on previous understandings involving my role. That is legal language for someone continuing to use my credibility after losing my consent. In that moment, my certainty settled in. I told him that from then on, I would communicate only in writing. He began to apply pressure, mentioning family stress, my grandmother's transition, my mother's health, and the sensitivity of the situation. I interrupted him. A serious problem for them does not create an obligation for me. Then I ended the call. After that, the situation unraveled piece by piece. A member of the charity board forwarded me, accidentally or deliberately, a draft invitation for a donor evening that my mother planned to host in the townhouse that had not even been purchased yet. The event description praised the Holloway family's continued commitment to dignified elder support. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been unpleasant. Knowing that my grandmother was being moved around like a display piece for a reputation campaign built on unsecured money made it worse. I also discovered that my sister had told several people I was managing the compliance side of the transition, a phrase vague enough to sound impressive, yet false enough to implicate me if the plan collapsed. At that point, the situation stopped being about emotional injury and became about self-protection. If their carefully staged narrative failed publicly while my name remained attached in the background, I would not simply be the daughter they used. I would become the professional whose credibility was damaged by their vanity project. So I gathered everything: the voicemail where my mother cut me off, the timestamps of my revoked permissions, the email confirming my withdrawal from all authorizations, the care facility's request for updated assurances, the donor event draft, and the messages from my sister. I organized them in a clean folder the way I would assemble any professional case file. Not to destroy them impulsively, but to ensure the truth had structure if it ever needed to be presented. That afternoon, my mother stopped pretending to be offended and revealed her actual perspective. She called from a blocked number. When I answered, she did not greet me. She began with a sharp accusation. "How dare you embarrass us like this?" Not, "Why are you doing this?" Not, "Why would you abandon your family?" Only embarrassment. That was the center of her concern. I replied that embarrassment comes from building a public life on promises you cannot afford to fulfill. She insisted everything they had done was for the family and described me as selfish, cold, and increasingly impossible to love. Then she made the mistake that removed my final hesitation. She said, "After everything we sacrificed, you owed us cooperation." Owed. Not love. Not trust. A debt. It was the same debt they had been collecting since I was 21, when I became the first person in the family who truly understood contracts, deadlines, and consequences. If anyone wants a clearer moment defining the conflict, that was it. Their cruelty did not begin with a single voicemail. It began years earlier, when my father borrowed from my graduate fund to cover a failed investment and told me not to exaggerate the situation. It deepened when my mother pushed me to skip a fellowship interview so I could help stage a charity luncheon she wanted photographed for local media. It hardened when my sister cried on my couch about overdue bills, accepted the money I wired to help her, and then posted vacation photos beside a pool 3 weeks later. Each time I objected, they called me harsh. Each time I fixed the problem, they expected it again. They called me family. Some of you already understand the kind of trap that phrase can become. 3 nights later, the entire situation exploded publicly, just not in the way my mother had planned. Remember the donor event draft she circulated before she even owned the property she intended to show off? It turned out she had not canceled the committee reception connected to that campaign. She simply moved the venue back to the charity's historic conservatory and informed everyone that the change of location was due to logistical adjustments. A mutual contact sent me the updated invitation with one short note: "You may want to know what's being said about you." I almost ignored it, but I opened the attachment. My mother had been presenting herself to donors as a caregiver under extraordinary pressure, a woman responsible for both her aging mother's future and the burden of an estranged daughter who had chosen resentment over responsibility. She was not only cutting me out privately, she was rewriting the story in public before the consequences could reach her. So I attended. I did not arrive intending to create a spectacle. There was no dramatic entrance, no confrontation prepared in advance. I arrived early, calm, and dressed the way someone naturally belongs in rooms where reputations matter. The conservatory was filled with glass walls, winter greenery, polished wood, and wealthy guests expressing polite empathy over glasses of champagne. I saw my mother immediately across the room, smiling with that charitable warmth she displayed whenever witnesses were present. My father stood near the donor wall, looking noticeably older than he had a week earlier. My sister laughed loudly beside a trustee from a regional health board I recognized. When my mother noticed me, her expression froze for a moment before she quickly crossed the room, her smile fixed tightly. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. I replied that I had been invited into the version of events she had been telling people. She attempted to guide me toward a side corridor, but 2 nearby guests had already turned toward us, so she kept smiling. I answered softly that this had become the place the moment she used my name to hold her narrative together. That unsettled her. She whispered that everyone already knew I had been difficult, unstable, and vindictive since withdrawing support during a family crisis. I asked whether by support she meant my credibility, my labor, or the authorization she continued using after cutting me off. The question landed harder than expected. My father, standing only a few feet away, looked down at the floor. My sister quickly joined us, tense and anxious. She muttered that this was not the place for such a conversation and insisted our mother was barely holding things together. I looked at her and remembered every time she had relied on emotional appeals to shift the consequences of her decisions onto someone else. I answered that they had all seemed very determined to move forward without me. She grabbed my arm at that moment, and the action drew attention. A trustee turned toward us, followed by a donor couple and one of the event coordinators. My mother immediately changed strategy and raised her voice slightly, just enough to sound hurt rather than defensive. She said the situation was about my grandmother. The intention was clear. If I did not yield, I would appear heartless. Instead, I calmly replied that we should discuss my grandmother then. Silence settled across the space. In environments like that, quiet spreads slowly but noticeably. I asked whether the care residents had been told the deposit relied on a property closing that had not yet occurred. I asked my father whether the property seller knew the old house required more repairs than originally presented. I asked my sister whether she had told people I was still managing compliance, even after I revoked that role in writing. There were no raised voices or dramatic gestures, only direct questions that punctured the image they had carefully built. My mother tried to stop the conversation by calling me cruel. My father insisted the matter was private. My sister began crying, but by that point the wrong people were already paying attention. A trustee stepped closer and asked calmly whether I had actually been involved in the transition. I replied that I had not been involved after being told not to contact them again, and that I had the voicemail, withdrawal notices, and timestamps if clarification was necessary. My mother's face went pale, not angry pale, but the color of someone realizing the room now cared about documented facts. Within minutes, the board chair pulled her aside while the event coordinator quietly contacted someone from legal. My father looked ill, and my sister kept repeating that it was all a misunderstanding. No one of influence was comforting her. The most decisive moment came from an older donor I had met only briefly before. She looked at my mother and asked calmly whether charitable commitments had been discussed before her own household obligations were secure. The sentence was precise enough to shift the entire atmosphere. Everyone understood the meaning behind it. Had she been presenting generosity funded by resources she did not actually control while relying on a daughter she had publicly criticized? My mother attempted to respond but could not produce an answer. I left before the situation turned into a spectacle. However, I did not leave without consequence. As I walked toward the exit, Graham Pike intercepted me near the coat check. His earlier composure was gone. He asked whether the matter could be resolved quietly. Quietly is a word people often use when they mean before the consequences become permanent. I explained that I had no interest in drama, only distance and accuracy. He informed me my parents were now facing the collapse of the property sale, scrutiny from the charity board, and possible complaints about misrepresentations tied to a care contract. I told him that sounded serious, took my coat, and went home. The experience did not feel like victory. It left me tense, unsettled, and unable to sleep. I replayed the evening repeatedly, not because I regretted telling the truth, but because families like mine train you to feel guilty the moment you stop absorbing the consequences for them. During the weekend, my phone filled with new messages and shifting strategies. My father texted that my mother's blood pressure had risen and that the situation had gone too far. My sister sent long messages about trauma, loyalty, and how I was punishing everyone over what she called a communication problem. My mother alternated between silence and brief hostile comments, suggesting I had damaged my grandmother's future out of spite. None of them acknowledged the sequence of events. She cut me off, they continued using my role, I withdrew properly, and the facade collapsed under its own weight. I did not solve the situation with a sudden moment of clarity from a supportive partner. I went to therapy because my hands shook when I opened my email and because I recognized something uncomfortable. Even after everything, part of me still wanted permission to stop rescuing them. I met a trauma therapist named Dr. Elise Mercer. Instead of offering cliches about empowerment, she asked a single question. When did my family first teach me that usefulness was the price of belonging? I sat with that for a long time. I remembered being 13 when my mother began asking me to mediate arguments between her and my father because I was the calm one. At 16, I started reading loan documents out loud because the adults in my home preferred optimism to details. At 21, I was told delaying my own plans for a year to stabilize the family was noble. By 28, I understood there would never be a final emergency, only a rotating series of crises connected by entitlement. Dr. Mercer did not instruct me to forgive anyone. Instead, she told me to document my reality so no one else could rewrite it. I followed that advice. I wrote down the events I had minimized for years. The graduate fund quietly drained, the fellowship opportunities undermined, the temporary caregiving tasks that evolved into unpaid project management for every crisis my parents created, and the way my sister learned that tears could redirect money and effort toward her faster than honesty ever could. Once it was written down, the pattern stopped looking like family chaos and started resembling systematic extraction. Eventually, my father asked to meet at the old house, promising a calm discussion without conflict. I went, although cautiously, bringing dates, screenshots, and a clear commitment to facts. The house appeared half-packed and strangely empty. Furniture was wrapped in moving blankets, artwork had been removed, and cracks in the entry trim, once described as minor, were now obvious. My mother sat at the dining table already composed, while my sister waited nearby, looking angry and exhausted. The first 10 minutes consisted of revision attempts. My mother said the voicemail had been sent in anger and was never meant literally. My father claimed everyone had been under pressure. My sister insisted no one had misused my name and had only assumed continuity. Then I placed printed timestamps on the table. The revocation notice, title company correspondence, the accountant's email, the care liaison's inquiry, the event draft, and the comments from the board member. Facts change rooms quickly. They remove the comfortable ambiguity manipulative people rely on. Their responses shifted immediately. My mother slammed her hand on the table and accused me of enjoying making them feel small because I understood systems better than they did. My father argued none of this would have happened if I had simply helped the family instead of acting superior. My sister accidentally revealed the real issue when she said I always behaved as though the money belonged to me. I answered that the money was never the issue, only the consequences attached to it. No one responded because that was the center of the conflict. They wanted access without responsibility, image without financial stability, dependence without gratitude. In the middle of that argument, my mother admitted something revealing. They had expected me to delay purchasing my own condo that year because someone responsible needed to behave like an adult rather than ask questions. She spoke about my life as though it were family property available for redistribution. At that moment, something inside me became very still. Not broken, just still. The last excuse disappeared. I told them I was finished, not temporarily, not until emotions cooled, but permanently finished participating. I would not restore access, attach my name to transactions, or intervene with the charity board, the care residents, the broker, or the accountant. If explanations were required, they could provide them themselves. My father called that cruel. My mother accused me of abandoning family. My sister warned that I would regret it if my grandmother suffered. I replied that the person who endangered my grandmother was the one who used her situation as social proof for a move they could not afford. Then I left while they were still arguing. The consequences unfolded over the next 6 weeks. The sale of the old property collapsed when the buyer requested deeper disclosures and repair credits my parents could not afford. The lakefront townhouse was sold quickly to another buyer with verified funds. The care residence withdrew its reservation after financial inconsistencies triggered internal review. My mother was quietly asked to step back from the charity's Elder Support Committee pending clarification of recent concerns, which in social language means the room no longer trusted her with its reputation or money. My sister's already fragile lifestyle soon unraveled. The emergency credit line she had emptied became impossible to hide once no one else was quietly covering her obligations, and the partner she had been impressing with curated luxury apparently valued honesty more than appearances. My father eventually accepted consulting work he had once dismissed simply to prevent his debts from growing. As for my grandmother, I refused to let her situation become another weapon. I did not rescue the entire family. Instead, through a separate documented process, and after confirming it would not reconnect me to their financial arrangements, I helped secure a modest and reputable placement for her through a social worker unconnected to my parents' plans. There were no luxury marketing brochures or donor events, just safe care, transparent costs, and professionals who understood. Dignity does not depend on marble counters or ceremonial speeches. When my mother learned about the arrangement, she called angrily, claiming I had humiliated her by downgrading my grandmother's future. That reaction revealed everything. For her, care had always been about image first and human needs second. What changed in me was not hardness, but refusal. I stopped reading every message they sent. All legal or financial communication went into a separate folder and received written responses only when necessary. I told extended relatives a short version of the truth before my mother could complete her narrative that I was unstable. Some believed me immediately because they had noticed more than I realized. Others did not, which was acceptable. One of the freedoms of leaving a fixed family role is understanding that you do not need to convince every audience. You simply stop volunteering to be the stage. About a month later, Graham Pike contacted me again. This time, it was not to negotiate reconciliation, but to request a formal statement confirming the timeline of my withdrawal from family-related transactions. The charity board, the care residents, and a lender all wanted the sequence documented. I signed a clear statement that did one thing. It separated my name from their actions. No accusations, no emotional commentary, just a precise record. In many ways, that document was more damaging than any public confrontation, because once the facts were fixed, the claim that I caused their problems stopped working. The final meeting happened later at my mother's attorney's office. She asked to see me there, because by that stage, even she understood that any conversation between us required witnesses. I attended mainly to see whether she could speak honestly once. She looked smaller than I remembered, not transformed by reflection, but reduced by consequences. She did not begin with an apology. She described stress, embarrassment, and what they had lost. I listened until she finished. Then I reminded her that she had told me not to contact them again, that I had respected that boundary, and that they continued using what I built after pushing me out. That was why everything collapsed. She cried then. The tears may have been real, but tears are not proof. They are simply emotion. My father stared down at the table. My sister did not attend. Eventually, my mother asked if anything could repair the situation. Many difficult families hope there will always be a final moment where the dependable child explains how to restore normal life. I realized the honest answer was no, not out of cruelty, but because some structures should remain collapsed. You do not rebuild a house on top of a sinkhole simply because the people who ignored the warnings are now afraid. I told her she could not fix this with me. She could only live with what had happened without turning me into the repair system again. My father asked whether that meant I was cutting them off permanently. I answered that they had done that first. I was simply refusing to return. Then I stood, collected my coat, and left while my mother called my name in the voice she once used when she expected history to reverse itself for her comfort. It did not. The final outcome was straightforward. My mother lost her committee role, and much of the social influence she had built through performative generosity. My father sold the old house months later for less than expected after repairs he could no longer dismiss as cosmetic. My sister downsized quickly and disappeared from the circles she once displayed online. The narrative that I was unstable or vindictive faded once people realized I had been the quiet infrastructure behind their respectability for years. It turns out panic follows when the person doing invisible labor finally becomes visible only long enough to leave. As for me, I purchased my condo that fall, the one they had expected me to postpone because someone else's crisis mattered more than my plans. I signed the documents alone, without a group chat, without family approval, without a dramatic call. Just a clean pen, a clear title, and silence that felt earned rather than imposed. Some people believe revenge must involve shouting, public humiliation, or a perfectly delivered line in a crowded room. Sometimes it looks different. Documentation, boundaries, and refusing to keep others comfortable simply because they share your last name. Sometimes the deepest form of justice is allowing people to experience the full weight of a life they built on top of your unpaid loyalty. So consider the question honestly. If your own family cut you off, continued using your name, and only panicked when the system stopped working without you, would you return to help them? Or would you let them move forward entirely on their own? In my view, this story is not only about family conflict. It reflects the moment someone finally stops acting as the emotional and financial safety net for people who value them only when they are useful. What makes Ava's experience meaningful is not revenge itself, but the decision to choose self-respect, clear boundaries, and emotional clarity over guilt and silence. The strongest lesson is simple. Love should not require endless sacrifice without accountability. Sometimes the healthiest decision is not immediate forgiveness, but protecting your peace, learning from the pain, and refusing to allow toxic patterns to define your future. Do you think Ava acted too coldly toward her family, or was this the only way she could finally protect herself? And if you were in her position, would you forgive them?